to some extent, you put on blinders. You would not take $100,000 and buy $1 million position in the stock market.
Right. I love saying that. Like, you walk into your financial planner's office, imagine he tells you to do this. You would think he was crazy.
So you wouldn't do that. It would be just this humongous financial risk. You're offering an alternative that will mitigate some of that risk, but people are just rationalizing it, saying, I'm not going to think about what happens if it goes, it's not going down.
Hi, I'm Brodie Gay, and I'm the VP of Research at Unison.
Hi, I'm Terrance Odean. I'm the Rudd Family Foundation Professor of Finance at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley.
We've been wanting to do this for a long time, so I'm really excited to have you here.
Thank you.
This beautiful day. People are going to think this is a green screen, but this is actually what we get to enjoy.
It's real.
So Terry, you've had a very interesting and idiosyncratic journey to becoming a professor at the Haas School of Business.
I wouldn't recommend the path that I took. I think I got lucky. I dropped out of college 5 months before graduation. And then 17 years later, I was living in Berkeley, married, had a daughter. My wife, I owned a house, and I thought, well, it's probably time to get serious about a career. At the time, I was interested in psychology and clinical psychology, and I went down to UC Berkeley to ask if I could enroll. And the admissions officer said, well, you've dropped out of your senior year. We don't like to take senior transfers. I recommend you go back to your school, finish, and then apply to grad school here.
And that was in creative writing.
Initially, I was interested in math and physics and psychology. By the time I got to the end of my first round as an undergrad, I was a creative writing major.
So you spent a little time in every department at the university. You wanted to get to know everyone.
Yes, I
You're
took
a very social guy, so that doesn't surprise me. And that probably helped you, the creative writing, with all the articles that you've published and all the creative titles that you've come up with.
I hope the writing more than the sort of like creative side.
Sure, yeah.
Writing is important in influencing people. Richard Thaler, a friend of mine and one of the recent Nobel Laureate, is a great writer. And I think one of the reasons he's had so much influence in terms of promoting behavioral economics is he writes well. So I went back to school to major in statistics with the intention of taking a number of psychology classes and then applying to grad school in psychology. And I got very lucky because Daniel Kahneman was teaching at UC Berkeley at the time. Danny and his research partner Amos Tversky, who studied how people actually make decisions and the biases that they have. Their work is the foundation of what's now behavioral economics. So I signed up for his course, and as I was approaching graduation, I was thinking about grad school. I asked Danny if I could talk to him about grad school, and he invited me over to his house one Saturday morning, and I basically said, well, I'd like to study psychology with you. And he said, well, if that's what you really want to do, I'll be happy to have you as a student, but I think you should consider going into finance. Which was sort of a surprise, but it made some sense. For one thing, Danny knew that I had pretty actively traded stocks, something, by the way, I do not recommend. But at the time, I was a statistics major, which gave me enough of a math background to actually get admitted to a finance PhD program. And what Danny said is, if you go into psychology, into the behavioral decision area, you could be working in an area where Amos and I picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit. Innovations are going to be a little less frequent. They'll tend to be more technical. He said, if you go into finance, you might get lucky. Behavioral finance hasn't taken off, but if things go well, you can be one of the early people. Then he sort of said, on the practical side, if things don't work out academically, you'll have a PhD in finance, and you can get a job.
You can make some money.
You'll make more money than you will as an academic anyhow.
That was the beginning of the saltwater, freshwater war between the ones who believe that everyone's very rational, and I guess you guys believe that there's cognitive biases that kind of impair our decision making.
Yeah, well, what really attracted me to finance was I did a little reading and I realized, wow, here's an academic field where the dominant theories are based on the assumption that people are hyper-rational when it comes to money. They'll accept that there are some people who aren't, but in the models, those people don't matter.
Right.
They all sort of wash out. Sometimes people say, okay, well, the people with biases, they won't survive because it's survival of the fittest, or they'll make random errors that will cancel each other out. But in fact, what Kahneman and Tversky had shown is that people have systematic biases. They don't just make mistakes, but you can predict the type of mistakes they'll make, when they will, and when they won't.
And enough people making the mistakes means it will show up on the radar.
Right. It's only pretty much the humans who make these mistakes,
right.
But most of us are.
Exactly. Yes. We still, you never know, though, in 20, 30 years. So what is the definition then of a cognitive bias? And I wanted to spend a little time talking about some examples. So, what are these mistakes, and how does it relate to Daniel Kahneman's idea of thinking fast and thinking slow?
Sure. I would think of a bias like this. It's a way that you're making a decision that people who study decision making in your field would say, well, that's not the right way, right? Like you might make wrong statistical inferences. And the other thing that really sort of makes it a bias is that if I sit down with you and I explain to you why it's an error, you'll agree with me.
Right.
Right? So it's not like you're saying, that's how I like to do it. I don't care what you say, but it's sort of like, oh, I see, I'm overestimating the chance that'll happen. I'd be better off doing something else. As far as Danny's book goes, he sort of talks about these sort of two systems, the thinking fast and thinking slow. The thinking fast is an important part of being a human or
survival, maybe evolution.
There are many situations where you just have to make a decision, either because speed is required or because you just can't spend an hour deliberating every single thing you do.
Right.
So we make decisions. And the thinking slow is more reflective. It's the part of you that takes a look at that occasionally monitors what that faster decision process is doing. So a lot of the cognitive biases, they fit into the thinking fast side. Like we make quick decisions, and these may serve us quite well in many situations, but often there are situations where they predictably don't serve us well.
Right. Well, it's interesting you said that it's something that you could sit someone down and explain to them, and they would understand, oh yeah, I made a mistake in judgment there. At a lecture, Daniel Kahneman said that he even believed that even now that he's studied this for decades, he still can predictably make the mistakes while knowing that he's making them. Yeah. And I was wondering, if we get smarter and more educated, is it something we can overcome, or is it something that we are always, I guess, a slave to making some of these cognitive
Oh, it's probably
biases?
a combination.
Right.
So just knowing that you have a bias doesn't in and of itself solve it.
Immunize you.
It's like knowing that you've been eating too much lunch doesn't suddenly solve it. However, it does give you an opportunity to either develop better habits or to put systems into place, a choice architecture, set things up in a way that lead to better outcomes and better decision making. Simple example, people have a hard time saving. And everyone involved in sort of personal finance knows that there's one partial solution, which is you automate your savings.
Right.
Instead of waiting to the end of the month and saying, how much money do I have left over? I think I'll save that. You immediately have money deposited in your retirement account or your long-term savings account. It just works better.
It's taking the choice out of it almost. It's not letting yourself fall victim.
So at a time when you do reflect, you say, okay, I have a tendency to make this mistake. What could I do to mitigate this? I've studied what's called the disposition effect, the tendency of people to hold on to losing investments and sell winners. From a tax point of view, that's suboptimal, and in many respects, it doesn't work out well for people. And professional traders exhibit this as well as individuals. But professionals are more likely to sort of set up a system, like maybe the boss will say to the portfolio manager, if you have a position and it's dropped 10%, you sell it.
Right.
Or somebody for themselves might say, well, I'm gonna flag anything that has dropped a certain amount, and I'm going to sit down and ask myself, would I buy this today? Which is asking the proper question. So you can put systems into place that help you deal with the biases, but on a day-to-day basis, I think the bias is first going to be there.
Right.
It's a little bit like reacting to things that trigger you. Someone once said to me, you can't control the first thing you feel, if your spouse shouts at you or something like that.
Right.
But you can control the first thing you say.
Got it.
And so, like, the bias, that's the fast thinking.
It's like the lizard brain. It's going to react, but you can control, maybe you build a structure around it.
You step back and say, this is an important decision. Let me reflect on that before.
Right. I wanted to talk a bit about some of these cognitive biases, and I think that's a great place to start. So, and since we're a real estate equity company here at Unison, I figured we should talk about cognitive biases as they relate to home ownership, home buying, because it's such a big financial decision that somewhere where people hope to make a very good decision. It's going to affect the rest of their life. So the disposition effect actually is that people tend to not want to sell their homes when they've lost value, but people are ready to sell their home when it's gone up in value and maybe trade up. That's a persistent effect in real estate, is that home sales, the volume decreases in these depressed markets, which leads to illiquidity, it leads to all sorts of problems. And I'm wondering, is this an example of the disposition effect? Is this a cognitive bias, or is this maybe strategic?
I think there's a couple things going on. There are some practical reasons why this is true, and then there's the psychological reason.
Right.
So on the practical side, I guess for round numbers these days, when you say you might buy a house, the round number would be for $1 million. It seems outrageous, but
you're welcome.
There's nothing in sight there that you can buy for less.
Welcome to the Bay Area.
Right. If you buy a house for $1 million, and we may talk about this later, but you might be putting $100,000 down, or maybe
even less nowadays, sadly.
Right? And if the house drops in price by 10%,
you've lost.
And you sell, it's not just that you've lost 10% of the value of the home; you've lost your entire down payment.
Exactly.
So one reason is that you might be sort of what is called underwater. And if you sell this house, you won't be a home buyer. You'll be forced into the rental market because you don't have money for another down payment. Another reason is transactions cost, but those should slow people down on both ends.
Sides.
Yeah. But the psychology part is there. And I actually have a personal story along those lines. I had a neighbor who was a retired professor who died probably about 20 years ago or so. And he had a son and a daughter who inherited the house. And basically the cost basis got reset. They owned it with cash, and it was theirs to sell. And they intended to sell it. I knew the son and daughter, and I said, well, my house is getting a little small for my family. I was thinking of, I'd make you an offer on your house. And the market at the time had dropped a little bit, and a real estate agent had come in about a year earlier and said to the son and daughter, this house is worth $400,000. This is 20 years ago, and I was offering $300,000. And they said to me, well, we just don't feel we can take that big of a loss. And the interesting thing to me was they used the term loss. The house had been bought probably for like $20,000 or $15,000 years ago.
They reset their reference frame.
Their reference point was now this real estate agent who just walked in had said it's worth $400,000. So they didn't sell it to me. That was fine. They sold it about 14 months later for $40,000 less than I offered them. They paid a real estate commission, and the house had sat empty, not earning any income for a year. So it turned out not to be a good decision. Of course, it could have gone the other way. It was the psychological anchor.
Right. It re-anchored to the higher price, and therefore they saw it as a loss.
It had nothing to do with down payment, transactions cost. In fact, the transactions cost went up. It was that they thought it's worth $400,000. It felt like taking a loss. And this is sort of the psychology of the disposition effect, is that when you sell something for a loss, you feel bad. You feel regret. You say, that didn't work out right. When you sell for a gain, you say, whoopee. It may not make sense if you think as a finance professional about portfolio theory and stuff, but psychologically, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think with real estate, there's this belief that it will always recover. So if you just hang on long enough and you don't sell when let's say you've lost that 10%, which is your entire life savings, then you can at least recover back to ground zero.
And chances are, if you live long enough, you might. But what if you had bought Tokyo real estate in 1989?
Exactly. Right. And that's
Tokyo
exactly
real estate had gone up for 39 years in a row. You say you're in Tokyo and your uncle keeps saying, well, real estate could go up or down. After hearing him say that for 16 or 18 or 20 years, you just say, he's a nice uncle, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. You buy real estate, Tokyo 1989, it still hasn't recovered.
Right. So that takes us a little bit to types of sample biases. So the survivorship bias is another example where I think this could affect how people think about the performance of their home. And, let's say all of your neighbors are people who've had or are having successful investments in their home, people who've been foreclosed on or can't cover their mortgage payments, so they had to sell. They've been removed from your sample of neighbors. So does that affect how we think of the performance of the investment?
Sure. But I think it's probably a lot of it's not as idiosyncratic as that, like one neighbor's out and another neighbor's out.
Right.
It's areas.
Right.
So you're buying in San Francisco, and all you can think is, I wish I bought 10 years ago, I wish I bought 20 years ago, I wish I bought 30 years ago. There are parts of this country where you don't wish you had bought 10 years ago.
Exactly. Take Detroit, for example, which has been in decline for a long period of time.
For a long time, yeah. As you said, there's markets where there are a lot of buyers and lots of sellers, and there's markets where at least there are no buyers. And those tend to be the depressed ones. So we do have a very strong tendency to think that the recent past is what the future will be.
Right.
Kahneman and Tversky studied that. They sometimes called it a recency effect or representativeness heuristic. But this idea that we over-extrapolate. So you see this in real estate, you see it in stocks, you see it in financial advisors. People want to buy the mutual fund they wish they had bought last year. They want to buy the stock or the asset class that went up last year. They get very excited about real estate when it's gone up recently. And there have been some depressed markets here, but we're sitting in the middle of the biggest real estate sort of bull market, like right here in San Francisco in my lifetime. So everyone here is thinking, well, it's a no-brainer. It can only go up. And you study this and real estate, like other investments, goes both ways.
Right, and you don't always see it moving because you don't have that stock ticker every single day like you would for a Facebook or an Amazon. So there's that hidden risk. Just take an example of the Tokyo real estate market. It seems like that is a very valuable exercise to not just be consumed by this recency bias of the current bull market in real estate in San Francisco. So is that a tactic that people can use to give themselves a better estimate of the performance of an asset? Is take the whole sample, take longer periods of time.
Sure. Not many people are going to do that. If you want to understand a process, like you want to understand real estate, you would say, well, let me look at what has happened in real estate in different places and at different times. Tokyo would be a big example because the market crashed and then didn't recover. It's just been eking its way back. But we've had crashes here. I mean, all you have to do is remember all the people who lost their houses, during the financial crisis. Right. Lots. You could drive out to some of the suburbs and go to neighborhoods that were in a very depressed state, 10 years ago. But in San Francisco, you think those are other people. That's a different place. It's different here. So one of the problems in terms of this sort of, getting perspective is that we have a great capacity to explain why it doesn't matter here, why this doesn't apply to me.
Happens to the others.
Yeah, so you can pretty much, human beings are extremely good at convincing themselves about things they want to believe.
Right, yeah. We're rationalization machines.
Yeah.
We're a real estate equity company, and we buy the equity, and so we buy some of the risk from these homeowners. And so there's a certain type of customer who comes to us where they think their home's going to go up 10 or 20% per year. And I'm sure, we can find data points where that happens, but they think their home will go up that fast, and they can also accept that the average long-run real estate performance is 3.5% to 4%. Is that an example of maybe the overconfidence bias? Like they somehow have the secret to pick the right home in the right neighborhood?
Yeah, overconfidence or just sort of this self-serving. So there's a remarkable number of situations in which people are much better at predicting the behavior of other people than themselves.
Right.
That shows up with procrastination. It shows like a great number of things. How could you think your house is going to perform much better than homes have done so historically and still realize that everyone else's isn't? And it's this sort of pocket thinking that we do, where it's probably to a large extent making sense of the emotions that you feel or you want to feel. I want to feel good about my house. It's much easier for me to be realistic about Brodie's house.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, you get the whole view of it, from the space view of all of Earth, you can kind of see it and you can...
I've mostly studied investors in the stock market, and you find that if you ask people how they expect the market to perform, well, for one thing, they expect it to do pretty much what it did the year before, even though you should be looking at a much wider sample.
Right.
And they usually expect their own portfolio to do better than the market, or at least many, many, many people do, which could be possible if you were taking more risk. But generally speaking, they don't think they're taking more risk. They just think they're going to do better. These self-serving biases, optimism, overconfidence, they serve a purpose in our lives.
Right.
So if you're a little bit optimistic, a little bit overconfident, waking up every morning is just a little more fun.
Yeah.
You think, I'm going to have a great day. It's easier to go to work. People who have these mild biases,
compels
they
you
help
to do
people.
so.
There's a lot to be said for it, but it doesn't necessarily lead to better long-term decision making.
Right. Like you don't want it to insure the apocalypse, for example. What's the point of having this great insurance policy for when the apocalypse happens? You might as well be a little bit more optimistic to help you get out of bed. I remember seeing this in my behavioral economics class that I took in college. They asked everyone to put their hand up if they thought they were an above average driver.
Yeah.
And everyone in the class put their hand up, which isn't really statistically possible. Right?
Everyone's a lot. I used to ask that question to my MBA students at the beginning of the semester. Usually what I would get, I gave them a range. I'd say, look around the room at the other students in this room, many of whom you may not know, and estimate how good of a driver you think you are relative to the other students.
Right.
And usually a quarter of the class would put themselves in the top 10 percentile, and all but a few students would rate themselves above average. Now, I would occasionally ask students who had put themselves at average or below why. And my favorite answer was a young woman who had rated herself as average. And she said, well, I was going to put myself above average, and I realized that in the last year I've gotten 3 speeding tickets, I've caused 2 traffic accidents, and I have to go to court next month or else they're going to revoke my license. I guess I'm just average.
So I wanted to talk about one last one that I think is very relevant for us is a home, like you said, you're putting only 10% of the value, so $100,000 into $1 million home. And so if this home goes down 10%, you've lost your entire net worth is gone. And we also did some research together on what is the risk of an individual home. And we found, and which is corroborated by the Federal Housing Finance Association, that a home is as risky as a basket of stocks. And so how do people take so much risk in this investment and at the same time have such risk-averse behavior in other aspects of their life? Saving for retirement, buying life insurance, all these kind of low-risk activities while still taking 10 or 20 or 30 times leverage on one big investment.
A lot of it is basically cultural norms and a desire to buy. I want to buy, and the only way that I can see to do it is, I've got $100,000, the house is $1 million.
Right.
This is my only option, and I really want to buy, and other people are doing it. And to some extent, you put on blinders. You would not take $100,000 and buy $1 million position in the stock market.
Right. I love saying that. Like, you walk into your financial planner's office, imagine he tells you to do this. You would think he was crazy.
Yeah. So you wouldn't do that. It would be just this humongous financial risk. You're offering an alternative that will mitigate some of that risk. But to some extent, people are just, rationalizing it, saying, well, everyone's doing it. I think it's basically necessity with a little bit of rationalization, or even better than that, I'm just not going to think about that side.
Right.
I'm not going to think about what happens if it's not going down.
Whenever I'm investing or trading, I always like to look at my portfolio, or I like to look at the positions that are doing well, and I hate looking at the ones that aren't doing well. I just kind of put them out of sight, out of mind. Yeah. I'm sure that's related to this effect. Does it help that we don't know the value of homes, every day, every minute, like we do with stocks? Does that help us take more risk in the position because it's latent, it's unobserved?
People would benefit from understanding homes are risky investments. They're also long-term investments. So I'd say being aware of the risk going in is useful. And once you've purchased, it's a good thing that you can't get obsessed with looking at the variation.
Yeah.
When it comes to like stocks, what I tell my students is, buy a well-diversified portfolio of low-cost mutual funds or index funds, and don't follow it day to day.
Right.
I take a look at my portfolio seriously about once a year.
Right.
I sit down, I'm doing my taxes, I take a look, how are we doing? Like once you've bought the house, don't obsess. Just like once you've bought your stock portfolio, don't obsess. It'll probably lead to poor decision making.
Right.
A friend of mine, Jonathan Clements, used to write a column, Getting Going, for the Wall Street Journal. And he called me one day when the market had taken a dive and said, well, what do you recommend people do? And I said, well, if you're on the West Coast, it'd be a good day to go to the beach. And if you're on the East Coast and it's raining, you might go to a movie. But whatever you do, put away the Wall Street Journal and stop thinking about your portfolio. This is not a good day to be making long-term investment decisions.
Right.
So before buying, people should be aware of the risk. Before you make any major financial decision, you should understand the risks you make. Once you're in a position, you shouldn't obsess about small movements in a long-term investment.
And on that topic of diversification and diversifying the risk across a portfolio, that's where I think I have had the best experience explaining our product and what we do with prospective homeowners and home buyers. You have all this risk in one asset. This is just one way of getting some of the risk off of it and maybe diversifying your portfolio, buying some stocks or bonds. All right, this is the rapid fire portion of the interview where I will ask you very quick questions and I want very quick responses. So no thinking slow. We're going to use the thinking fast part of your brain. When did you first buy a home?
I bought a home with my wife in 1983 in Berkeley, California. We were very fortunate because we were buying in a period where the market was slow. So unlike now where houses are selling in matters of days, this house had been sitting on the market. We did a couple of things that were, in hindsight, very good. My wife had a real estate agent's license, which gave her a lockbox key. We could go around and look at all of the houses in Berkeley. And we looked at everything on the market. I probably looked at 40 houses in our price range. So when we saw the house we bought, I knew that was the one I wanted to buy. I knew it was a good price, and I liked it.
Question 2. What were some of the best and worst parts about becoming a homeowner?
Well, we were going to have a family. There's this sense of I'm settled down. I had traveled quite a bit. After I bought a home, I think I told you earlier, I went back to school, I got a career. So it felt like I was growing up. The worst part was I made a lot of mistakes. I bought an old house and had work done on it. I found out later that while I had walls opened up, I should have been doing seismic work. There's a lot of things in life that you only do once or twice, and quite often after you do them, you find out that you should have done them differently. So that's one of the challenges with home buying.
My parents said the same thing about having kids. Is a home a good investment?
Usually, a home is a good investment if you're buying a home that you can afford, and you know that you're going to be living, or you have good reason to believe that you're going to be living in the same place for several years. It's like any other investment. There's no guarantee. You got to be buying something you can afford. You have to be paying a reasonable price, and you have to stay there long enough because there's a lot of transactions costs involved in buying a home, and it takes a few years, basically, even with normal growth, to cover those.
It's the most important piece of advice you can give someone when they're buying a home.
Figure out what your price range is, not based on what you want, but what you can afford. Figure out what you can afford. Look at things you can afford, because things you can't afford are always going to become appealing. You're going to say, I'm going to stretch, which is not a good idea. So figure out your price range. Look at a lot of houses in your price range. And when it comes time to buy, get at least 4 quotes on a mortgage and make sure that you're comparing mortgages with all the same fees and features and get a good interest rate.
What is the biggest personal finance mistake you made in your early adult life?
Probably the biggest personal finance mistake I made in my life was something that turned out to have benefited me in an unusual way. It was this. I got interested in the stock market and I traded actively without any information. I bought, I sold. And why this turned out well is because when I got my PhD, I studied finance, I studied behavioral finance, and my dissertation was focused on investor behavior. And I would just look back at my own experience and say, well, I did that. I bet everyone's doing that. For example, there's something called disposition effect. I wrote part of my dissertation about it. It's the tendency to hold on to your losing investments and sell winners. And I thought, I always did that. It must be what others do. And when I obtained data on investor trades, that's what I found.
Okay, a spin on that last question. What is a personal finance mistake that you keep making even after you've extensively studied why you're making it?
All right. Well, I can tell you the mistake that I make over and over and over again. I'm overly optimistic about outcomes. Now, in particular, when I have a task to do, I'm going to write a paper, I'm going to make a video, I'm going to do, if I were to write a book, I would always underestimate how long things are going to take me. And I know the solution from a paper that Daniel Kahneman wrote, which is to take what he calls the outside view. Look at past examples, look at how long something has taken you in the past, how long it's taken other people. Look at outcomes. If you're trying to think about, well, should I expect my house to go up in value? Don't think about your house, just take a look at a broad cross-section of outcomes. What has happened to other people? What's happened to other people where you are in other places? There's a tendency to get too optimistic when you focus on your own situation.
What is the most surprising result you've seen come out of one of your research papers or endeavors, or that of some of the greats like Dick Thaler, Danny Kahneman, or Amos Tversky?
Well, the most surprising result that came out of my own research was on one of the very first papers I wrote. I'd written a theory paper that said if investors are overconfident, they are going to trade too much. And what I thought that was going to mean is that the stocks they bought and the stocks they sold would, on average, perform the same, but that the investors would lose money by running up transactions costs that were high. And then I got empirical data. I got trading records for investors making their own decisions at a discount brokerage firm. And to my surprise, I found that even ignoring the transactions costs, the stocks these investors were buying were underperforming the ones they just sold. So I was initially surprised and puzzled, and over the years I've come to realize that investors are probably creating situations that end up working against them. For example, buying stocks that have been going up for a while that are running out of steam, holding on to stocks that they own that are doing poorly until they get to a point that they feel like, oh, I have to sell and selling at a loss. So I think people are managing to lose money in a way that I didn't think was possible.
Pick one famous academic from the past that you would love to share a beer with.
Someone I want to share a beer with. Well, I would say I've been fortunate. I have gotten to share a glass of wine with my two favorite academics, Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, both of whom are brilliant and entertaining.